My name is Andy Greenberg, and I am a writer for Wired magazine. And I'm also the author of this book, Sandworm, which I hope will be seen as a kind of definitive account of the first ever true full blown cyber war to have taken place. That cyber war story, of course, starts in Ukraine, where all of you are. I am not, unfortunately. I'm here in New York, thanks to a global pandemic. But I'm honored to be able to speak at this conference, and I now have the very interesting experience of taking this story that I reported largely in Ukraine and then taking it out to a global audience and now bringing it back to a Ukrainian audience. The book was translated into Ukrainian and published just in May. So I hope that this story survives the round trip and that it remains meaningful to you as well, if only just to see how this very Ukrainian cyber war story resonates now for a global audience. But this story begins in many ways with this video. And this is a video that shows an HMI, a human machine interface, software that's used to interact with physical equipment. And in this case, inside of an electric utility in Western Ukraine, Prikarpatia Oblenergo. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And what the operator is filming here is the cursor on the screen trying to open circuit breakers, which would turn off the power to the customers of this utility. Now the person pulls back their phone and shows that no one is touching the mouse. This mouse is moving totally on its own, what we call a phantom mouse attack. The hackers have taken it over and they are using it manually to try to click through circuit breakers, turning off the power to Ukrainian civilians. This actually was filmed in the midst of the first ever cyber attack to actually cause a blackout. And 250,000 Ukrainians in Western Ukraine lost power for several hours. This was a true historic event. But I would not really get onto this story until a year later, when my editors at Wired asked me to find the big story of cyber war. And I think what they had in mind, of course, were the Russian attacks on the US election of 2016. This was something that was on the top of every news editor's mind at that time. But I honestly didn't see that story as a true cyber war story. That to me seemed kind of just like digital dirty politics in a way that's been done for many decades. But I went out looking for what I could give them as a true cyber war story. I mean, cyber war to me means a nation state attacking another and using cyber attacks to disrupt, to attack critical infrastructure, to break things. So I went looking for that kind of story. My former colleague, Kim Zetter, had written an excellent story about that first blackout attack in Ukraine. And so I looked deeper in Ukraine, and I began to see a story you know well, which is a country that had experienced the revolution, that had pulled away from Russian influence, and Russia had responded by invading. That physical invasion had been accompanied by digital attacks on every part of Ukrainian society, the media, private industry, the government, and then ultimately these electric utilities. And I could see that although I was kind of late to this story, it was still unfolding. There was a real cyber war here. And just as I began to look, it happened again. There was a second blackout attack, this time in the capital of Kyiv, where you are right now. So this second attack actually hit a transmission station kind of further up the circulatory system of Ukraine's power grid. And so I could see that, in fact, this cyber war was still escalating in a sense. And although I was a bit late to it, I could still jump in and tell this story. And I wanted to tell it in a new way, I guess, like capturing the human experiences. Good war journalism tells these first-hand experiences. It captures the stories of the combatants and the victims and the people who are the collateral damage in a war. And I wanted to do this with cyber war. So I went to Ukraine for the first time. One of the first people I met was Alexei Yasinski, who was the chief information security officer at Starlight Media, the TV broadcaster. He had done the incident response on an attack by this mysterious hacker group that would come to be known as SANDWORM. In fact, the subject of several years following of my obsession. But he had fended off this attack on Starlight Media, and then he had left to go to Information System Security Partners, this Ukrainian security firm, where he kind of became a go-to incident responder for wave after wave of these attacks, all by the same hacker group, SANDWORM. And then finally, in late 2016, he was sitting down to watch a movie with his family, and when at the stroke of midnight, he lost power to his home and suspected very quickly that this was that same group of hackers. He had actually been caught in that second blackout attack. And to me, this captured perfectly both being a detective working on this and also a victim of these attacks. And he felt this in a very personal way, that these attackers had now invaded his personal space. This was the sort of personal human story that I was looking for. I also spoke with the operators at Prikarpatia Oblenergo, that Western Ukrainian electric utility that was hit by that first blackout attack a year earlier. And I found this amazing thing about Ukrainians that I am very grateful for, which is that Ukrainians are willing to tell the stories of being the victims of a cyber attack. Unlike pretty much every victim of a cyber attack I've ever tried to interview, these operators at Prikarpatia Oblenergo shared with me every detail of what they had experienced, from the blackout that hit their customers to the blackout that hit them as well, because their backup power supply was also turned off by these attackers. The attackers used a kill disk wiper to destroy all of the data on their computers, and then they even bombarded the facility with fake phone calls in this kind of last act of punishment. This was a truly brutal attack, and these operators were so open about sharing this with me, and even airdropped from their iPhone to mine that video that I showed at the beginning of this talk. And I met with Oleg Zaichenko, who worked as Ukrenergo, a different utility, and was on duty the night a week before Christmas in 2016, sitting, in fact, at this desk when, just at the stroke of midnight, the alarm went off above his head, and he looked to his right and saw that one of the lights on the control panel had turned from red to green, signaling in the language of electric utilities that a circuit breaker had been opened, that part of the power of the transmission station had been turned off, essentially. And he picked up the phone to call his supervisor, and as he did, he watched every other light on that control panel turn from red to green, red to green, red to green in rapid fire. Now, as in fact, a fraction of the entire electric capacity of this transmission station and the power in a fraction of the capital of Kyiv was turned off. That blackout only lasted 1 hour, which was very curious, because, in fact, it turned out, this attack used a new piece of malware called Indestroyer, or Crash Override. In some ways, it was the opposite of the attack that had happened a year earlier, although it would turn out to be the same attackers. But this was an automated attack, not that kind of manual takeover of a mouse to click through circuit breakers. Instead, this was almost like Stuxnet. It was, in fact, the second piece of malware since this notorious Stuxnet malware that could interact directly with physical equipment. Crash Override or Indestroyer could do this too and send commands directly to circuit breakers, machine gun style, opening them faster than anyone could respond. Joe Slowick, an analyst at cybersecurity firm Dragos, would later find that this was actually meant to be just the first step in the attack, that after the power was turned out, the malware would also send a command to the protective relays on this grid, which are kind of safety equipment, turning off those safety devices so that when the operators hurried to turn the power back on, they might have caused dangerous conditions, overloading lines with charge, burning lines, destroying transformers, potentially harming the staff themselves. This was a truly insidious attack that could have caused serious physical damage, a much longer blackout, and only failed because of a small misconfiguration in the malware. This was a stroke of luck that it was not far worse. I didn't know all of this at the time, that I was talking to Oleg Zaichenko in Kyiv. What I did see, though, was that this cyber war in Ukraine was escalating, and in fact that there was experimentation happening here. There were many things happening here that were not happening anywhere else in the world, one after another. And it seemed, in fact, that Russia was experimenting in Ukraine, using Ukraine as a test lab for cyber war. And I wrote this cover story for Wired about this notion that Ukraine was a cyber war test lab, but also that what was being done in Ukraine should not be ignored by the West, by us in the US, because sooner or later, this Ukrainian cyber war, the attacks that Russia was inflicting on Ukraine, would spread to the rest of the world. It was only a matter of time. And when you make a prediction like this, you don't honestly want it to come true, but you certainly don't want it to come true the very week that you put it in print, which is unfortunately what happens. The very day that this magazine began to appear in people's mailboxes in the United States, this screen began to spread from Ukraine to the world. This, of course, is NotPetya. And it looked at first like a ransomware attack. I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar with these sorts of screens that demand a Bitcoin ransom to unlock a computer. And I at first was fooled. I thought that this was a cyber criminal ransomware worm. But when I called my sources in Ukraine, including Alexei Yasinski, they immediately saw this for what it was, that it was a destructive worm, that there was no way to pay the ransom, that it was probably the work of Russia, that it was part of the ongoing cyber war in Ukraine. And they were right. It would turn out that NotPetya was a destructive worm, unlike any other we'd ever seen before. It used a combination of Eternal Blue, the stolen NSA hacking tool, and Mimikatz, this notorious credential password stealing tool in combination, but then combining those also with hijacking the software updates of Medoc, this incredibly common Ukrainian accounting software I'm sure you're all familiar with. And the result was that it simply carpet bombed the Ukrainian internet. It hit 22 banks by some reporting that I've heard, 4 hospitals in Kyiv alone, hundreds of Ukrainian companies, according to ISSP, pretty much every government agency. This was, in fact, the climactic attack of those SANDWORM hackers, it would turn out. But of course, although this seemed to be targeted at Ukraine, internet worms do not respect national borders. And I quickly began to hear these numbers from multinational companies as they reported to their shareholders the losses from this cyber attack. $129 million from Reckitt Benckiser, this manufacturing firm that makes like Tylenol and Durex condoms. Mondelez, which owns Cadbury and Nabisco, lost $188 million. Maersk, the world's largest shipping firm, lost $300 million. FedEx lost $400 million. Merck, this New Jersey pharmaceutical giant in the United States, lost $870 million. Today, they're actually saying that their losses are closer to $1.3 billion. These are staggering numbers. Any one of them alone would have represented one of the worst cyber attacks I had ever covered. But together, this was unlike anything I had ever seen before. And I felt a little bit like I was being gaslit, like I was going crazy, because it had been very clear within days of this attack, thanks in large part to the work of this Slovakian cybersecurity firm, ESET, that connected NotPetya to those earlier blackout attacks and the data destructive attacks in Ukraine, that this was, in fact, the work of the same group of hackers, that this was, again, SANDWORM, Russia carrying this out. And yet, no Western government, the United States, not European governments, no one was willing to say that this was Russia that had done this. And none of these companies, in fact, wanted to talk about it at all. None of these companies would share a single detail of how they had experienced this really unprecedented cyber attack. So I returned to the country where I knew that people would talk about this, and I came back to Ukraine. And I kind of did a very whirlwind oral history of the effects of NotPetya in Ukraine. I spoke, for instance, to Volodymyr Elmelyan, the Minister of Infrastructure, who in this very refreshingly candid way told me that NotPetya was like a massive bombing of all of their systems, that on that day of June 27th, 2017, the government was dead, simply. This is the kind of statement that I never would expect to hear from a government official, only in Ukraine. And I met with this guy, Pavlo Bondarenko, who was an IT administrator at the Ministry of Health. And he had seen NotPetya spreading. He had very quickly advised the Minister of Health to unplug their entire network, all of their network connections. And in doing so, saved some of the Ministry of Health's probably most sensitive data from destruction. But after this day of fending off NotPetya, he, at 6 p.m., left the office to go home, and tried to get onto the Kyiv metro. But as he swiped his card, he found that the system had been taken out by NotPetya. And so he had to go try to get a physical token, but he didn't have any cash, so he went out into the neighborhood to find an ATM and found that all the ATMs in the neighborhood had been taken out by NotPetya too. He finally found an ATM in another neighborhood, managed to get a small amount of cash, used it to buy a token, got on the metro, went to his home neighborhood of Kyiv, and then he tried to go grocery shopping and found that the point of sale systems in the grocery store had been taken out by NotPetya too, and had to go out to get more cash. He didn't have enough. All the ATMs in this neighborhood too were down. And he began to feel, as Pablo described it to me, like he was in a kind of end of the world movie. In fact, that was a direct quote. And he also said that it felt almost like he was missing a limb, that the way that he had grown accustomed to interacting with the world had simply been broken. This, to me, it was like a true and very powerful, visceral description of the experience of cyber war on this scale. And I met with this woman on the right, Olesia Linik, who is the CEO of Linkos Group. This is her father on the left, who founded the company. And it's a small family-run business. They make, of course, Medoc, this accounting software that had been the patient zero in this attack. And this was tragic for them, not only because of the reputational damage that they suffered as the kind of vector that was used to spread this terrible, worst ever cyber attack, but they also suffered the effects of it themselves. Their network also was destroyed and would take weeks to rebuild. And then, in fact, a week after NotPetya hit, vans of police pulled up to their headquarters in the outskirts of Podil and poured out in militarized uniforms, running up the stairs as if this is like the Bin Laden compound, pointing semi-automatic rifles at people. They kicked down a door. They took the servers, as if somehow this was the source of this terrible cyber attack, when in fact it was pretty clear from forensic evidence that, the real source were these Russian hackers who had carried it out with impunity thousands of miles away. So as I was reporting out this Ukrainian experience of NotPetya, I was also kind of banging my head against the wall, trying to capture the effects of NotPetya globally, trying to get any one of these multinational companies to share their experience of this attack. And finally, thanks to a few very brave sources inside of one company, I was able to share that experience for Maersk, the world's largest shipping firm. Now, Maersk had one installation of this accounting software, Medoc, in its Odessa office. And that one copy of Medoc alone was enough for NotPetya to infect that computer and spread to Maersk's global systems, devastating their entire global network. And what that felt like on the ground was, according to one person on this kind of campus of their headquarters in Copenhagen. I took this picture from the outside. They never actually let me inside the building. But there's one source inside of this headquarters described to me on that afternoon of June 27, 2017, seeing his screen just go black without explanation. And as he kind of stood up to look around the room to see if anybody else was having a problem, he watched a wave of black screens spread across the room, just black, 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 as essentially NotPetya ate the network of the Maersk headquarters alive and infected every computer. Within minutes, Maersk staffers were running down hallways, yelling at each other to turn off computers, running into conference rooms and unplugging machines without warning to try to spare them from this worm. They were jumping over the physical turnstiles that separated parts of the building to try to spread this message. But even those physical turnstiles had been paralyzed by NotPetya itself. But of course, Maersk is not just a kind of, it's not just an office or an IT firm. Maersk runs a massive global shipping machine that accounts for a fifth of the world's global shipping capacity. They have 76 terminals in ports around the world that they own as well. And one of them is here. This is Maersk's terminal in Newark, New Jersey. And I chose to focus on it in part just because I could see it from the window of my office in Manhattan. And this is a full square mile man-made peninsula where ships the size of the Empire State Building on its side frequently arrive carrying another Empire State Building's worth of containers on top of them, tens of thousands of boxes. And on this day of June 27, 2017, no one could figure out what was in those boxes. Maersk's inventory systems had been destroyed. Its ability to perform this incredibly complex Jenga game of unloading those many thousands of containers was simply dead. The gate at the entrance to this terminal, which serves as a kind of checkpoint, trucks, 18-wheeler trucks pull up to this gate, and they're told where to go to pick something up or drop it off. This used a voice over IP system that was also taken out by NotPetya, and the gate was locked. Trucks began to line up by the hundreds outside of this terminal, a line that stretched miles long. Maersk could not even communicate with these poor truck drivers. They couldn't even send them an email. That's the degree to which their systems had been taken out. And all of these truck drivers are eventually told by the port police, you just have to find somewhere else to put your cargo today, another shipping line or a warehouse or something. And these are truck drivers who are carrying containers full of, avocados and diapers and components of just-in-time supply chains and perishable goods that have to be refrigerated. This is a huge and extremely costly fiasco, but it wasn't just playing out in New Jersey, of course. It was happening across the world. At Maersk's terminals from Los Angeles to Newark to the Netherlands to Algeciras in Spain to Mumbai. This was happening at 17 of Maersk's terminals. This was a kind of fiasco multiplied to a global scale of the kind that really has never been seen before in shipping or anywhere else. Maersk very quickly began to launch this global IT recovery operation, a kind of crisis recovery. They made this building in Maidenhead, a town outside of London, into their global recovery operations center. And they told really anyone who worked in IT anywhere in the world for them to just fly there and get to work immediately. People were sleeping in hallways and under desks in conference rooms. They turned other conference rooms into kitchens. People were essentially living there. They brought in the consultants from Deloitte, who they paid millions of dollars to try to make this problem go away. But they very quickly discovered that they couldn't even get past the first step because, amazingly, they did not have a single backup of a domain controller. Now, domain controllers are essentially the backbone of any large enterprise network. They set the rules for who has access to what, as I'm sure you all know. And Maersk has more than 100 domain controllers around the world. But they were designed to back up to each other in this kind of redundancy system. But, so what that means is essentially that if you lose one, that's fine. If you lose a dozen, that's okay. You have all of these other backups. What they had not prepared for was a situation where every single one of those domain controllers is wiped simultaneously, which is exactly what NotPetya did. So this was a truly heart-stopping moment when they realized this, but they began frantically to call every data center that they had in the world. I mean, Maersk is a very large company. And finally, in this kind of miraculous moment, they found that there was still one backup of a domain controller in Ghana. This one data center in Ghana had actually lost power. They'd had a blackout, not a cyber attack induced blackout, just a kind of normal blackout of the kind that hits this Ghana data center from time to time, apparently. And that perfectly timed blackout had preserved the data on this one domain controller. It was offline at the moment that NotPetya spread around the world. And so they had this one backup, but they had to get it from Ghana to Maidenhead in England. So they tried to set up a secure connection from the Ghanaian data center to Maidenhead, but the Ghana data center didn't have enough bandwidth, it turns out. So they tried to fly the Ghanaian staffers to London, but they didn't have the right visas. So they had ultimately to do this kind of wild relay race where they flew the Ghanaians to Nigeria, where they met Maersk staff in the airport. They did this relay race handoff of these USB drives, which were then flown to London, driven to Maidenhead, where they kind of finally could begin the process of copying those backups onto other USB drives, sending them around the world to start the process of recovering their global network. A process that involved rebuilding 45,000 PCs and 7,000 servers, ultimately it would take weeks and ultimately actually 2 months to get back to any real sort of normalcy. So that is the experience of Maersk. That's how they lost $300 million to NotPetya. And in fact, most Maersk staffers have told me that they believe it was probably more. But now you have to imagine that same sort of catastrophe playing out inside of Mondelez, inside of Benckiser, inside of FedEx, inside of Merck, which actually, this pharmaceutical firm, its ability to manufacture drugs was disrupted by NotPetya. It had to borrow its own human papillomavirus vaccine from the U.S. Center for Disease Control. It couldn't actually make any drugs. That's the degree to which NotPetya affected, well, each one of these firms. And if you add that up, that is how you get to $10 billion, which is the number that Tom Bossert, the most senior White House security official at the time, told me was the cost of NotPetya. And in fact, not the kind of upper bound of the cost, but the lower bound. NotPetya probably cost more than $10 billion globally. And even this number just measures the dollar cost of this catastrophic cyber attack. It doesn't count the human cost. And in fact, NotPetya, in this underreported aspect of the attack, affected hospitals too. And I spotted this Facebook post. On June 27, 2017, Brenda Pisarski was going into surgery at a hospital in Pennsylvania. And as she describes it, as she says, Europe or somewhere in that vicinity hacked into the hospital and shut down all their computer systems. It happened right after I got into the operating room. She says that her surgery went forward, but she saw people around her have their surgeries canceled. This was a pretty rare experience, actually. NotPetya, at least in the United States, only directly infected a couple of hospitals that I was able to identify in Pennsylvania. Far more common, though, was that hospitals felt the secondary effects of this company, Nuance. Now, Nuance makes speech-to-text transcription software, and they have an office in Ukraine. They were directly hit by NotPetya and lost $92 million. But more serious, in many ways, was the fact that Nuance is used in hospitals across the United States to update medical records. I spoke to the chief information security officer at this company, Sutter Health, which is a network of 48 hospitals across the United States. And the chief information security officer, Jackie Monson, described to me how on June 27, 2017, she kind of frantically called all of their hospitals and was able to determine that they were not infected with NotPetya, which she was relieved to hear. But within 24 hours, she found that they had a different and extremely serious problem, which is that they had more than 1 million changes to medical records that doctors had been reading into Nuance's software that had now essentially been lost. This was a kind of silent failure. Nuance was not transcribing the updates to medical records that doctors were reading in. And so what this actually meant on the grounds, I talked to an IT administrator at a major American hospital who described how a few days after NotPetya, a nurse ran up to her in a panic, saying they had a child patient who was due for a critical procedure, had to be transferred to another hospital, but they didn't know if the child's medical record had been updated, if the child had been had the tests necessary for this procedure. This was due to the Nuance outage. So this poor IT administrator had to comb through all of these raw audio files that had not been transcribed, find the one that applied to this patient, get it transcribed, get it added to the medical record, and they managed to do this just in time for that patient to be transferred. Then this happened 3 more times for other child patients in this one part of this one hospital. All of those patients had their procedures in time, thank God, according to this administrator who spoke to me. But she told me that even now she remains haunted by this experience because she knows that there are actually thousands of patients in a hospital. And then there were dozens or probably hundreds of hospitals just across the United States who experienced this Nuance outage. And when you do that multiplication problem, it becomes very hard to say that no one's actual health or life was affected by NotPetya. we in this industry, I think, in our industry, have waited and dreaded the moment when a cyber attack would actually be confirmed to have taken a human life. But in fact, NotPetya may actually have been that first lethal cyber attack, and that fact could have been hidden simply by the sheer scale of this attack and the complexity of tracing its second and third order effects. Now, in February of 2018, this statement appeared on the US White House website. This is maybe the shortest government statement I've ever covered as a reporter, and it said simply that NotPetya was the work of the Russian military, that it was the worst cyber attack in history, and that there would be consequences. And in fact, there were consequences. A month later, the United States imposed new sanctions on Russia and on the GRU, Russia's military intelligence agency, in reaction to NotPetya. So, in some ways, this maybe seems like the happy ending, but I would argue that this is too little, and it was absolutely too late, in the sense that this came 9 months after NotPetya hit. But even more so, it came more than 2.5 years after this cyber war had begun in Ukraine, a series of attacks that had truly crossed every red line that we in the cybersecurity industry have ever tried to set for kind of acceptable conduct in cyber war. It had violated every norm that governments might try to set about protecting civilians from these sort of cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. And until this statement, until the White House finally responded in early 2018, the West, the United States and Europe, had said nothing about this. They'd allowed SANDWORM, allowed Russia to attack Ukraine with impunity. So in the kind of third act of my book, this book is called SANDWORM, and I do try to track SANDWORM down to figure out who they are, who are the actual human beings behind these appalling attacks, to hold them accountable. But this is in some ways a story that is best told not about the attackers, but through the experience of the target. And Ukraine, in some ways, is the lens for this story. Now, Ukraine, in fact, its entire history, I think, is relevant here, because Ukraine, for 1,000 years, and I'm sorry to tell you your own history, which I'm sure you know better than I do, has been invaded again and again by the Mongols and the Turks and the Tatars and the Nazis and the Soviets, and finally, Putin's Russia. It was massacred in the Holocaust and starved in the Holodomor. And for this entire history, the West largely kind of ignored what was happening to Ukraine, allowed Ukraine to be attacked by its neighbors, treated it as this kind of faraway foreign problem, not our problem. Ukraine is not the United States. Ukraine is not even NATO. This is Ukraine's problem. Russia is Ukraine's problem. But in this new era of cyber war, the rules have changed, and geography itself almost plays by different rules. And an attack on Ukraine quickly becomes an attack on all of us. And we didn't realize that, despite all of the warnings of Ukrainians and cybersecurity researchers. We didn't realize that in the West until it was too late, until we too were hit and suffered the consequences. I'm reminded of the statement of Michael Hayden, who was the former director of the NSA and the CIA in the United States, who said that on the internet, we are all Poland. The inherent geography of this domain is that everything plays to the offense. And, I think what he was saying was a rather simple point, that cyber attacks are too easy, that defense is hard, that on the internet, we are all invaded, just as Poland was invaded by, both Germany and the Soviet Union. And I think, in fact, that he has an interesting point here, but that it goes deeper, and that he was only, in fact, a few hundred miles off, that on the internet, we are all Ukraine. And if we fail to learn the lessons of this Ukrainian cyber war, then we all globally will have to learn those lessons instead through our own very painful experience. Thank you.